Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to talk about my topic. So I'm going to do a research on healthcare inequities in African American populations. And this would be, for example, it could be for a class in bioethics or even a class in public health. So healthcare inequities in African American populations. And I have a pen and paper that I use to help map my research. So I'll write my topic at the very top of the paper, and then what I'll do is I'll pretend to have an essay set up. So I'll have intro, point 1, point 2, rebuttal, conclusion. And what I want to do is I want to be able to find, and I have a point 1 and point 2, and the point 1 and point 2, both I want to find enough research to where I can tell a narrative about healthcare inequalities in African American populations. And so that way, when I go to write an essay, if I were to write an essay on that topic, I would have my research mapped out in an organized way that suits my writing style. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Google Scholar. And the reason I'll go to Google Scholar is because I can search articles as well as journals. And then I'll also open up my library for my school, so my library system for my school, so that way I can locate journals easier, because sometimes I'll be on Google Scholar and I'll find a journal that I want to use, so then I'll just hop over to my library and see if I can access that journal for free. So that's what I have up right now, is I just have up my library search engine online, and I have up my Google Scholar search engine. So I'm just going to search healthcare. So the first thing I'm going to search is my main topic, which is healthcare inequities. In African American populations. And I'm searching that in Google Scholar first. What I want to do is I want to find the most recent data, so I'll click since 2019 and I'll hit custom range, and I'll make my range from 2019 from 2015 to 2019. And I will also just be looking at, not only will I be looking at, some peer review journals, but I'll also be looking to see where they come from and, if I feel like they're applicable. So one of the first things that I see that comes up that sparks my interest is black-white inequalities in mortality, and life expectancy. And it's a publication on, that was posted on NIH.gov, which is the National Institute for Health, and they're a government agency run by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So I go to them a lot, especially if on my Google Scholar search, if they come up as one of the first places, I'll click on that. So the black-white inequalities in mortality and life expectancy was a study done between 1933 and 1999, and it talks about the implications for healthy people in 2010, so it was written fairly long ago. So instead, I will go to the National Institute of Health and just look up African American populations and see what pops up. So when I searched African American populations, I got too many results. So I'm going to put in inequities in African American populations and see what happens then. So here we go, health disparities and inequities. So I'm going to click on that and see what happens. And I'm searching this in National Institutes of Health. So they're discussing health disparities and inequities, specifically in dealing with heart health. So one of the studies they did was the Jackson Heart Study. The project began in 1997. And the goal was to see the causes of disease in African Americans involving men specifically. So I will probably be, I'll be looking at the data to see if they have any more recent data. So there is one that says researchers search for disease markers linked to racially and ethnically diverse populations. So I'm going to use this article, and that's published on the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute's website. I'm going to use that article to get some data, so I'm going to write that article down into my intro section of my piece of paper. And then what I'll do is I'll keep this tab open. What else am I finding? See, so I just jump down the rabbit hole of what I can find. So this is a good one, understanding associations among race, socioeconomic status, and health. Because if I was doing this healthcare inequalities in African Americans, if I was doing this for public health class, in public health you'd want to look at what is affecting that overall population's health. And so by including socioeconomic status, this would be a really, really good article to use. And it's by the American Psychology Association, which does have reliable data because they follow a very strict pattern of ethics when it comes to publishing data and receiving, creating studies and publishing them. So this one is, it's a are social categories that capture differential exposure to conditions of life to have health consequences. So I would definitely want to use this as part of my research, because not only does it talk about the consequences, it helps discuss how, especially if I was doing this for a public health class, about how healthcare inequalities in African Americans is not just inequities in African Americans. With inequity comes a dependency upon how socioeconomics affects that. So I would probably use this. So then I would probably write that down. I'll probably write it down under point 1, even though I know once I start writing, it'll probably get all moved around when I actually start writing the piece. But for now, I just have a brief outline so I can keep note of how many sources I have and all that jazz. One thing I do like to do as well is, and I'll keep that as a tab, I'll also just regularly Google search and see what articles pop up. Because in those articles, especially if it comes from, one of the major reliable newspapers in America, you can find sources within the articles. And I also just open stuff that, catches my eye, honestly. And if I like the link, so this is from harvard.edu. And then I'll expand my search. So barriers to healthcare is a really good, barriers to healthcare helps because that also, there are inequities in just the barriers of transportation, that kind of stuff. So I'll also look at that. But let me see what I just opened up. So here's specific standard. I usually don't use them as a source, but I do like to skim through what they have to offer because you can find their sources. So what did they use? So when they say data suggests, where are they getting their data? However, this data... And overall, if I'm doing research, especially on a topic like this where it can be very broad, I try to find at least 10 sources. And then when I start writing, I narrow it down and see what fits as the most applicable use. So this is from the Economic Policy Institute, and that's where that article is getting some of their data from. And so when you're discussing lack of access to decent housing and the high poverty levels, you can include that in your research by thinking about how that affects health. So overall, I just try and find at least 10 sources. I try and keep my research well-rounded, and I also just want to make sure that I have credible sources. So if I find an article that I think is useful, but I don't feel necessarily like specific standard might be the most knowledgeable or reliant place to receive the information from, I'll find where they got their sources. I also look for wording. So it says health disparities between blacks and whites run deep.